On the 12th of July, 1955, a passenger aircraft departed from New York's airport, bound for Miami. 57 people were on board: businessmen, families with children, newlyweds heading off on their honeymoon. The weather that day was perfect, the sky cloudless, and nothing suggested anything could go wrong. 40 minutes after takeoff, the plane vanished from radar screens. Dispatchers attempted to contact the crew, but the radio remained silent. The captain's last words had been completely calm. He confirmed their course and reported that the flight was proceeding normally. And then nothing. Search operations continued for several months. Hundreds of square miles of ocean and coastal territory were examined. Not a single piece of wreckage. Not one body. No trace of fuel on the water. The aircraft had simply dissolved into thin air, taking everyone aboard with it. Relatives of the passengers refused to believe their loved ones had perished for years afterward. Some of them waited for a phone call or letter until the end of their lives. Children who lost parents grew up and grew old. Spouses passed away without ever learning the truth. The case was closed, the aircraft officially declared lost, and all those aboard presumed dead. 37 years later, on the 21st of September, 1992, a dispatcher at Caracas International Airport began his night shift. Traffic was light, and he expected nothing unusual. Around 3 in the morning, a blip appeared on his screen that had no business being there. An unidentified aircraft was approaching the airport from over the ocean. The dispatcher requested identification. The response came almost immediately. The voice sounded calm and professional. The pilot gave a flight number that meant nothing to modern aviation services. He reported that he was arriving from New York and requesting permission to land due to poor visibility. The dispatcher froze. He asked for the flight number twice. The pilot repeated it patiently. Then he added that everything was fine on board, the passengers were calm, and fuel was sufficient. His voice betrayed neither alarm nor surprise. Landing permission was granted. Within minutes, an aircraft touched down on the runway, a model that had stopped being manufactured 30 years earlier. Its fuselage gleamed as though the plane had just left the factory. The paint hadn't faded, and there wasn't a single scratch on the wings. Emergency services and police rushed to the aircraft. When the door opened, a flight attendant appeared first, wearing a uniform that no airline in the world still used. He smiled and inquired about the reason for such a large welcoming party. Passengers began emerging behind him. Women in dresses with full skirts, men in formal suits with narrow ties. Children clutched toys that had long since become antiques. A young couple with wedding rings looked exactly as they did in their wedding photograph taken 37 years before. One of the police officers approached the aircraft's captain and asked where they had flown from. The pilot answered that they came from New York and didn't understand why the question caused such confusion. He glanced at his watch, a classic chronometer from the 50s, and noted that the flight had taken just over 3 hours, right on schedule. When the passengers were told what year it was, some laughed, assuming it was a prank. Others began to panic. A young mother held her daughter tighter and asked them to stop joking. She was in a hurry. Her parents were waiting in Miami, eager to see their granddaughter. An elderly businessman pulled out a newspaper he had bought at the New York airport before departure. The date on the front page, July 12, 1955. The paper was fresh, the printer's ink barely dry. He handed it to the police officer and asked what was going on. Airport personnel didn't know how to react. Before them stood people who physically could not exist. Not one of them had aged a single day. The children's permanent teeth hadn't grown in. The men showed no gray hair. Wrinkles hadn't touched the women's faces. Their documents were authentic, but had long been invalid. The money in their wallets had been out of circulation for decades. Plane tickets, boarding passes, baggage receipts, all genuine, all from another era. One of the passengers, a schoolteacher of about 35, asked to call her mother. She gave a number that no longer existed. She was gently told that her mother had died in 1978. The woman didn't believe it. She refused to believe it because she had spoken with her on the phone that very morning before getting into the taxi to the airport. Local residents gathered near the perimeter fence, filming everything on their cameras. Video recordings from that day still exist, though the quality leaves much to be desired. They show bewildered people in old-fashioned clothing exiting an aircraft that shouldn't be flying. The passengers were taken inside the airport building. They were brought water, food, and attempts were made to explain the situation. Some accepted the news with disturbing calm. Others became hysterical. One man demanded to be connected with his wife. He didn't know she had lived a long life, raised children from a second marriage, and died a year before his return. The aircraft's captain maintained his composure. He methodically described the entire flight, takeoff, climbing to altitude, reaching cruising level. Then he mentioned a strange phenomenon, a bright white glow that had enveloped the plane approximately 40 minutes after departure. The light was so intense they had to close their eyes. When the crew regained their sight, it was night outside, and below them were the lights of an unfamiliar city. The navigator added that the instruments had shown impossible readings for several minutes. The compass spun continuously. The altimeter indicated they were below sea level. The radio picked up only static noise. And then everything normalized, as if nothing had happened. The co-pilot recalled that time in the cockpit seemed to stop. He watched the second hand on his watch, and it wasn't moving. He blinked, and it started again. He chalked it up to eye fatigue. Medical examinations of the passengers and crew revealed no abnormalities. They were perfectly healthy. Moreover, several people's chronic conditions had disappeared, ailments they had lived with for years. One passenger no longer had an appendectomy scar, even though the surgery had been performed 10 years before the flight. Technical inspection of the aircraft showed the machine to be in perfect condition. The engines ran flawlessly. The fuel tanks were filled with a type of aviation fuel that hadn't been used for 20 years. The flight logs contained entries for only one journey, that very flight from New York to Miami. News of the incredible event spread instantly. Journalists besieged the airport. Government officials arrived at the scene. Experts from various fields attempted to find a rational explanation. The theory of mass hallucination was immediately ruled out. Too many witnesses, too much physical evidence. The hoax theory didn't hold up either. It's impossible to fake an aircraft, impossible to age or rejuvenate 57 people, impossible to reproduce details that only those who lived in the 50s would remember. Some scientists cautiously began speaking of a temporal anomaly. Others recalled the Bermuda Triangle, though the flight's route passed hundreds of miles from that zone. Still others suggested a parallel dimension where time flows differently. But all these hypotheses remained just that, hypotheses. None received scientific confirmation. None explained how 57 people lived through a few hours while the rest of the world lived through nearly 4 decades. The reunions between passengers and their relatives became tragedies of their own. A young man of 25 embraced his son, who was now over 60. The father looked younger than his own child. They stood staring at each other, not knowing what to say. A woman who had been flying to visit her parents learned that both had long been resting in a cemetery. She went to their graves and couldn't believe that beneath those headstones lay people she had eaten breakfast with that morning. The married couple who had begun their honeymoon never reached their destination. They had to re-register their documents, restore identities that no longer existed. Their marriage had been registered in 1955. Technically, they had been married for 37 years. though they had only spent a few hours together. Adapting to the new world was incredibly difficult for the passengers. They didn't recognize the cities where they had grown up. Their friends had become elderly or had died. Their professions were obsolete. Their skills were worthless. They were strangers in a world that had moved on without them. Some could never accept what had happened. They refused to use modern technology, lived in the past, waited for the moment when they would wake up and everything would turn out to be a terrible dream. Others showed remarkable resilience. They learned new technologies, found work, built relationships. One of the passengers, a former engineer, wrote a book about his experience. It became a bestseller, though many readers were convinced it was fiction. The aircraft was seized by authorities and placed in a classified hangar for study. The country's best specialists examined it. They dismantled every component, checked every part, took thousands of samples, and found nothing that could explain what had happened. Captain Robert Manning, who had piloted the ill-fated flight, saw the same dream every night. He was back in the cockpit, watching the approaching white glow, feeling reality around him beginning to melt. But in these dreams, he managed to notice something he hadn't seen in real life: silhouettes behind the light. Something was moving there, in that impossible whiteness. Something was watching. He would wake in a cold sweat and sit in the kitchen of his rented apartment until dawn, staring out the window at a city he didn't recognize. The cars looked different. People dressed differently. Even the air smelled different, heavier, thicker, with a chemical undertone. His wife had died in 1983. His daughter, who had been 7 when he left, was now a 44-year-old woman with children of her own. She flew to Caracas as soon as she learned of her father's return. They stood facing each other in the airport lobby, and neither could utter a word. She saw before her a young man of 38, the same one who used to put her on his shoulders and carry her through the park. And he saw an unfamiliar middle-aged woman, and somewhere deep in her eyes, his little girl who had waved to him from the window as the taxi drove him to the airport. Their first conversation lasted 6 hours. She told him her entire life: school, university, first love, a failed marriage, divorce, second marriage, the birth of her children. He listened and tried to process the fact that all these events had occurred while he was flying over the ocean. Her mother never learned that her husband had returned. She had died 9 years before, believing until her last day that he was alive. She refused to declare him dead, wouldn't allow him to be legally pronounced deceased, and every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, she lit a candle and set 2 places at the table. When his daughter told him this, Captain Manning wept for the first time in many years. Or rather, for the first time in a few hours by his personal time, and for the first time in 37 years by everyone else's. The psychologists working with the passengers encountered a phenomenon described in no textbook. How do you help someone process loss when they themselves have lost nothing? How do you explain grief when only an instant has passed for the grieving person? How do you restore connections between people separated not by kilometers, but by decades? One of the passengers, Margaret Thompson, the elementary school teacher, kept a diary. She recorded everything she felt, everything she saw, all her attempts to understand what had happened. These entries were later published and became a crucial document for researchers of anomalous phenomena. In her diary, she described strange sensations she experienced in the first days after landing. The world seemed unreal to her, like a stage set about to be dismantled. Colors were too bright. Sound were too sharp. People moved somehow wrong, spoke too fast, used words she didn't know. But worst of all was a feeling she couldn't precisely describe. The sensation of being watched, not by people, not by journalists, not by curious onlookers, by something else. Something that had been in that light over the ocean and had somehow remained with her after the return. She wasn't the only one who felt it. At one of the passenger gatherings organized by psychologists, it emerged that almost everyone was experiencing something similar. They exchanged glances and understood each other without words. They were connected by something that had no name. Benjamin Cohen, the elderly businessman who had been flying to Miami for negotiations, discovered that his company had long since gone bankrupt. His partners had died, assets sold off, nothing remained of his empire. He had been a wealthy man who, in a few hours of flight, had become penniless. But wealth no longer mattered to him. After his return, he became obsessed with one idea: understanding what had happened to them. He spent what remained of his savings, recovered through court proceedings, on research. He hired physicists, mathematicians, quantum mechanics specialists. He funded expeditions to the region where the aircraft had presumably disappeared. The results of his investigations were ambiguous. Some scientists rejected the very possibility of a temporal anomaly. Others pointed to theoretical models that allowed for the existence of areas with altered time flow. Still others suggested the answer lay not in physics, but in something entirely different. One of the researchers he hired, Dr. Haywood Pierce, who specialized in anomalous atmospheric phenomena, noticed a strange detail. On the night of the aircraft's return, several meteorological stations in the Caribbean region recorded inexplicable electromagnetic disturbances. Instrument readings jumped as though the laws of physics had temporarily ceased to function. Moreover, similar disturbances had been registered in July 1955, around the time the aircraft disappeared. Two events, separated by nearly 4 decades, were connected by an invisible thread. As if something had opened in 1955 and closed in 1992. As if a door between two moments in time had briefly swung open, allowing the aircraft with its passengers to pass through. This hypothesis was never confirmed, but it explained much. Why no one had aged for them. Only a few hours had passed. Why the aircraft looked new. It was new, fresh from the factory by its own timeline standards. Why the fuel in the tanks didn't meet modern standards. It had been loaded 37 years ago. The newlyweds from the flight, David and Elizabeth Harrison, decided to stay together. Their honeymoon had transformed into a journey through a new world, and they clung to each other as the only constant in the chaos. They settled in a small town where no one knew their story and tried to build a normal life. Elizabeth gave birth to 2 children, a boy and a girl. She called them her anchor in the present. As long as they were growing, as long as they needed her, she couldn't allow herself to sink into the past. She had to look forward, but the past wouldn't let her go. Sometimes, putting her children to bed, she caught herself thinking that her own mother had done the same thing. Leaned over the crib, adjusted the blanket, kissed their foreheads. And her mother hadn't known her daughter would disappear for 37 years. That she would cry through countless nights. That she would die without ever knowing the truth. Elizabeth found her mother's grave at a cemetery in Ohio. She stood there for several hours, unable to leave. The headstone bore the dates, 1918 to 1979. Her mother had lived 24 years without her daughter. 24 years of hoping and waiting. David stood beside her in silence. He understood that no words could help. He too had lost his parents, his brother, all his childhood friends. His former life remained on that aircraft that departed New York on a July morning in 1955. Over the years, the passengers of the flight began losing each other. Some died of illness, some of old age. Paradoxically, they did begin aging after their return, as if time had finally caught up with what it had missed. Some took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of what they had experienced. By 2010, only 17 of the 57 remained alive. They still gathered once a year, on the anniversary of their landing. They sat in a restaurant, looked at each other, and remembered, not the past that was common to all humanity, but their own personal, impossible past. Margaret Thompson, the teacher with the diary, lived to 93. She made her final entries a week before her death. Her handwriting had become uneven, letters jumping and blurring, but the meaning was clear. She wrote that she no longer feared death, that over the years she had come to understand something important. Whatever had happened to them over the ocean, it wasn't an accident. They had been chosen. They had been led through time for some purpose. And though she never learned what that purpose was, she was grateful for every day she had been given. The last entry in her diary consisted of a single phrase, "The light is returning." The nurse on duty that night later recalled that a few minutes before death, Margaret opened her eyes, looked somewhere beyond the window, and smiled, as if she had seen something familiar, as if she recognized whoever had come for her. The investigation was officially never completed. Case materials are still stored in government archives under a classified designation. The aircraft still stands in a sealed hangar, and only a handful of people with the highest clearance level have access to it. Periodically, rumors leak to the press about new research. They say modern technology has detected microscopic traces of unknown origin on the aircraft's exterior. They say spectral analysis has shown the presence of elements not found in the periodic table. They say that in the black box, previously thought empty, a recording was found, a few seconds of static noise concealing something resembling a voice. But these are only rumors. Officials refuse to comment. The only thing they confirm, the investigation continues. Decades after the landing, someone is still searching for answers. Perhaps these answers will never be found. Perhaps some mysteries exist precisely to remain mysteries, to remind us of the limits of our understanding, to prevent us from believing in our own omniscience. Every time an aircraft takes to the sky, passengers look through their windows and see clouds, earth, endless blue. They don't think about the possibility that somewhere out there in that blue, a rift might be hiding, a door to another time, a portal to the unknown. They don't think about it because they don't know. Because the story of the 1955 flight is just one of many that never became public knowledge. Because disappearances continue, and not all who vanish return. And those who do return stay silent. They have learned to stay silent. They know no one will believe them, that they'll be thought insane, that it's easier to forget than to explain. And somewhere in the sky, over the ocean, at that point where instruments begin to malfunction, where the compass spins endlessly, where time becomes malleable as clay, something waits there. Something ancient and patient. Something that was here long before us and will remain after. It is neither evil nor good. It simply exists. And sometimes, for reasons we cannot comprehend, it takes. And then, years or centuries later, it returns. The passengers of a 1955 flight were returned. But what about the others? What about those ships that vanished without a trace? Those expeditions that never came back? Those people who walked out of their homes and dissolved into thin air? Perhaps they are still out there somewhere, in that strange place outside of time, where seconds stretch into eternities and centuries flash by in an instant. Perhaps they are alive, healthy, and young, with no idea that the world they knew has long since crumbled to dust. And perhaps one day they too will return, step out of the light as the passengers of that ill-fated flight did. Look up at the sky and not recognize the stars. Ask what year it is and refuse to believe the answer. We can only wait and hope and watch the sky, wondering what hides beyond the clouds. Because the universe keeps its secrets and shares them only when it chooses.